encourage these young men to do that kind of work. I read the story of a young man who was on the side of the road and putting hay back on a truck that had fallen off. And this clergyman was walking down the road, and he saw this young man working hard putting that hay back on the truck. And he saw the young man sweating. And the clergyman walked up to him and said, "Why don't you take a rest?" And he said, "No, I can't do that." He said, "My daddy wouldn't like that." The clergyman said, "Sure, why don't you take a rest? You need to take a rest and get a drink of water." He said, "No, my daddy wouldn't like that." He said, "Where is your daddy? I want to talk to him. I want to give him a piece of my mind. He needs to let you rest. Where's your daddy?" And the young man said, "Under the hay." That's why he wouldn't like it. And what that says is this: we all need someone in our lives who make a small difference. In Acts chapter 27, Paul is on his way to Rome. And I doubt when they set out that they expected a storm to happen. But a storm came, and the answer to the storm was, well, we're just all going to jump overboard. Now, there's not much sense in the middle of a storm on a boat in the middle of the ocean about jumping out and thinking you're going to be any better off than being in the boat. That's why the storm is taking place. But the Lord had already told Paul prior to that, look, this is going to happen, and if everybody stays with the boat, you're going to live. And sure enough, Paul convinces them all to stay in the boat, and sure enough, all of them live. Those that could swim swam ashore. Those that could not found a piece of wood and were led by the waves to the shore. And everyone, 270-something men were saved that day. Well, where they landed was Malta. I'm not sure they intended to stop there, but they landed at Malta. And the event would have taken place somewhere probably in our calendar year of about October, November. And Malta would have been an unlikely place because it was a Phoenician island. Later, people who were Canaanites came from that island. And so they would not necessarily have been people that Paul would have thought about visiting along the way. A little unusual. And furthermore, you never know when you are swimming water to an island you don't know about whether or not you're going to be welcomed or whether you're going to be somebody's dinner. They did not know. But as it turned out, they were welcomed. And it says, beginning in Acts chapter 28 and verse 1, when they had escaped, they found out that the island was called Malta. And the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. Notice it says, and the natives showed us unusual kindness. I like that from the New King James because the Old King James says barbarians. And the idea of barbarians is much like the way it is used in Acts chapter 2 when the apostles are called barbarians. And that is, they were not they were not speaking in a native tongue. They were people who spoke in a different tongue than what the natives did. Therefore, they were called barbarians. And the speech that they said would become something like bar, 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 bar. In others, unintelligible to those who were natives. But notice what happens when they said they then found themselves. It says that they showed us unusual kindness, and they made us all welcome because of the rain. But reading verse 4, it says, so when the natives saw the creature, verse 3, but when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. So when the natives saw a creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow to live. But he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Can you imagine that scene? I mean, they welcome him, they start a fire, and then Paul is bit by this viper that they know is absolutely poisonous. How would you have responded to that? I got to tell you, I probably would have yelled like a girl and run as fast as I could the other direction and never looked back. I don't think what I would have done would have said, I'm just going to shake him off. And then stand there quietly and as though, oh, that was a mosquito, get rid of him. But he does that. And of all things, he's not affected by it. And in utter amazement, these people ask in their minds, who is this? And then it continues. In that region, there was an estate of the leading citizen of the island, whose name was Publius, and he received and entertained us courteously. And happened that the father of Publius lay sick of fever and dysentery. Paul went into him and prayed, and he laid his hands on him and healed him. And when they had done this, the rest of those on the island who had deceased also came and were healed, who were diseased also came and were healed. They also honored us many ways, and we departed. And when we had departed, they provided things for us that were necessary. After 3 months, we sailed into Alexandria. So they spent 3 months here on Malta. This is the last sermon in the series that Jordan and Ryan and I have been working on, lessons about people with forgotten lives. I don't know whether you've paid much attention to this man in verse 7 or not, Publius, but there are several lessons I think that are significant that we learn from this man and these people on Malta. And I'd like to explore 2 or 3 of those with you this morning. The first thing I'd like for us to consider this morning is I think it's important for us to notice that people who are not Christians can be nice and generous too. People who are not Christians can be nice and generous too. In fact, in Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus will talk about love your enemy, pray for them, do good to them, that you may be like your Father who causes the rain to shine and the sun to fall on the just and the unjust. And then in verse 48, he says to love as the Father loves, as opposed to how those in the world love. And so he talks about the hospitality of the world. And the hospitality he challenges the kingdom citizens that is to be different than the world. But what the point he makes is he's using the world as an illustration. And the illustration of the world is they're hospitable to one another. But they also expect a reciprocity. They also respect a return invitation. But they were generous. How many times are stories told where people from a church having someone in the hospital or someone who has died, and no one from the church came? No one provided a meal. But the neighbors in the neighborhood, they got together and they provided a meal. I think we need to be careful about drawing conclusions that people in the world are necessarily evil and can do no good. The heart wills to show kindness. The heart longs to receive kindness. And the heart also longs to supply want. It also longs to give thirst to those who drink and to clothe those who are naked. I'm reminded of Matthew chapter 25 when the Lord talks about that day in which the disciples would have seen him. He said, when will we say we have seen you? Say, when will we see we have seen you 3 times fast, 10 times real fast? 10 times real fast. When did we do these things? What things? Fed you, clothed you, visited you when you were in prison? He said, when you did it unto the least of these my disciples. Well, what do people of the world do? People of the world supply the want of others. So when I was in Perry this last week, the announcement that was made several times was there was a collection that people were making down at the police station in Perry, that a trailer was going to be taken over to the area that was decimated by the storm. And they wanted non-perishable things. They wanted things like toiletries. They wanted wet wipes. They wanted water. Please water, please water, please water. They wanted canned foods. Well, the Christians there weren't the only ones that were supplying that. The community was supplying that. In fact, when I landed, I didn't realize I had been sitting right next to a FEMA fella. And when I got off, there were hordes of FEMA people and Red Cross people that were there. These were people that probably, for the most part, were of the world. But these are people who are pouring out for their fellow man to provide for the needs of their fellow man. And here's Publius, and here Paul comes into this region, and like those who are of the region, he says in verse 2, so he welcomed him into his home. He probably was some kind of official in the city. And he also obviously had a home that was of some size, because you have 270 plus men that are here that he entertains for three days. In fact, he entertained us courteously for 3 days. Here's this man who is not a Christian. And here's this man that welcomes this stranger into his home, as well as those who have traveled with him. Here is the man who demonstrates a heart that God created in mankind to be kind toward others, but does not fail to be reciprocated in kindness. Because Paul, it will also say in verse 8, that Publius had a father that lay sick, and Paul went and prayed and laid his hands on him, and he also was healed, as well as others in the region. That kindness was reciprocated because Paul was able to do that. I'm reminded of how the kindness of the Lord is described in the book of Titus. In the book of Titus, chapter 3. Titus chapter 3, and it says, verse 4, But when the kindness and the love of God our Savior toward man appeared, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to His mercy He saved us through the washing of regeneration and the renewing of the Holy Spirit. But when the kindness and the love of God appeared. Publius, though not a Christian, is demonstrating that which God has put in man. I'm reminded of the words of the Lord in Matthew chapter 11 and verses 28 through 30, when He offers that invitation for all to come. You who are weak and weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. My burden is light. There's an imagery to that. Men who used to work oxen would have one that was trained, and then they would have one they were training. And what they would do is they would yoke them together. And the one who was trained, they would hold a tighter rein on the one that was trained and a looser rein on the one that was not. So that the one that was not trained with that tighter rein would then follow the example of the one that was trained. My burden is light. I'll carry the burden. I'll carry the load. My burden is light and my yoke is easy. I'll be the one that will bear the burden for you. That's what happens here, is you have this man of the world that bears the burden for these men that come. And I think we need to acknowledge that even people of the world who aren't Christians can be nice and they can be generous. The third thing I think we see from this story, we see from this story, is don't turn away the generosity of others even if they're not Christians. And notice Paul doesn't turn away the generosity. There are two sides of the coin. Kindness loves to be given, but kindness loves to be received. Hospitality loves to be given, but hospitality loves to be received. Generosity loves to be given, but generosity loves to be received. When I was thinking about this, I thought back 9 years ago, this coming November 13th and 14th. I thought about 9 years ago, when I wound up in the emergency room of downtown Baylor Hospital. Not really knowing a lot what was going on. I got to tell you, there's two things I remember, and there are other things that have been filled in. The one thing I remember is the attending doctor saying, "Mr. Jenkins, do you have a living will?" Which is kind of a startling question. And the second thing I remember is this was the first of many I did not see and did not remember. But the next thing I remembered was Brian Davis showed up in the door. And I thought, well, that's nice. He came to see me. I didn't know behind the scenes my daughter was calling everybody that she could call. I think she touched Breck first, and then he began to call others. And what I also did not know was how many were in the waiting room and the prayers that were being offered. And I got to tell you, there are still things today that took place 9 years ago that I learned along the way that I did not know took place. And here's the point I'm making about that. I love to visit people when they're in the hospital. But I got to tell you, the reason I love to do that is for me. But I learned something that day. What I learned was how much it does the good the person that's visited. And how much it meant to Jody and to me that our brethren came and rallied to hold us up. Now that's an illustration from us as brethren. But there was one key figure in that whole thing that made it work, and that was a guy by the name of Dr. Kyle Doty. And he said, we're going to tap the brakes on the surgery. I think we know what it is. And tomorrow we'll know for sure. He wasn't a Christian, but he made a significant difference that night. Here's Paul. This man had every right, every expectation to turn away Paul and these 270 plus men. I mean, they're wet. They have been in the water. They're smelly. Here are these men, and he had every right. But now then, Paul is on the receiving end of generosity, not on the giving end. How many times do we see Paul and we see him more on the giving end than the receiving end? But now he's on the giving end. The giving end when you prepare a meal for somebody because they suffered loss. I simply use this as an illustration, not for glorification. Bill Hatfield reminded me about a year ago, the first time I ever came to visit him in the hospital. It was while Bill was not faithfully serving the Lord. His heart had been hardened. And he had knee replacement surgery. And so I just went by and visited with him. I had forgotten all about that. But he remembered it. You see, those little things that we do make a memory for people. How many of you, I know the elders have, I know I have, I know Jordan has, how many of you receive a little card in the box from the kids in the little classes? I keep a file up there in my office. I take every one of those and I put them in that file. I have a file of every card every child has sent me and keep that. And sometimes I pull them out and I just read them. We receive a card, something that is innocent like that, but what it does is that little thing, it's that little thing that is generous that makes a difference in our lives. Kim Welliver told this story on one of his blogs. He told a story about a young lady by the name of Katie McClure who was traveling out of New Jersey into Philadelphia on Highway 95, and she began to have car trouble, and so she pulled off, and as she pulled off, it just so happened the car trouble she was having was that she ran out of gas. There was this fellow by the name of Johnny Bobbitt who was a homeless person. He was on the street. And he came up to her, she getting out of her car to walk to get gas, and not a very good place for a young lady to do that. He said, you get in the car and you lock your doors. I'll be back in a minute. So she got in her car, locked her doors, and just a little while, he came back with a tank of gas and put gas in her car. The last $20 he had, he put gas in her car with that. And she said, I'm so sorry, I don't have any money. But she came back the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And when she came back, she brought him food. She brought him clothes. In fact, she even started a GoFundMe page and raised over $400,000 for the man. Generally $50 and $25, $10 donations from people of about 14,000 people or more that contributed to that GoFundMe page, which enabled him to get off the street, buy a house, buy a car, and set his life straight. Now, there are several lessons from that, I think, that are not unkin to what we see in Publius. That is, be careful about how you judge people. Be careful how you judge people. It would have been easy for her to have said, okay, I don't have $20, and to be fearful to go back. Be careful how you judge people. This homeless man, she might have judged him as homeless and not worthy of that attention. Further all, it speaks to the collective effort when people put their hands together, how they can provide much need for others. Because it took that great thousand group of people to provide for the relief that was there. But then Johnny Bobbitt said, I'm going to pass it on. I'm going to pass it forward. And so he took some of what he was and he set up a trust fund to be able to help others out of that trust fund. You see, here was a person that wasn't a Christian. Just a homeless man. And he came and he did something kind and generous, and she received that. Here, Paul received the hospitality, the generosity, the kindness that Publius offered. And then the third thing I want us to see is that Publius was with Paul and was with him 3 days. Notice what it says in verse 7. In that region there was an estate of the leading citizens of the island, whose name was Publius, who received and entertained us courteously for 3 days. He was with him for 3 days. Again, he has every reason to not accept Paul. I mean, they're smelly, they're wet, their clothes are obviously soaked. There'd be every reason to look at them and say, you know, I just don't have a place for you in my house. But I think what that homeless man and what Paul and what Publius teach us is this. What Publius said to Paul was, you're welcome. And folks, what we need to be saying to people who come in that door is, you're welcome. Challenge you to think about something for just a moment. If someone comes in that door, man or woman, and they've got tattoos from head to toe, and their clothes are kind of filthy, how am I going to respond? But if someone comes in that door and they're nice shaven, they're clean, hair is in place, and have a nice suit or pair of clothes on, how will I receive them? You see, James talks about that. James talks about, in chapter 2, the man that comes in and he is filthy. And what that means is that not that he just didn't take a bath last night. He doesn't just have dirt on him, he's got dirty dirt on him. He's got dirt that is caked on him. He hadn't seen a shower, a bathtub, or a bar of soap in forever. And then you got this man that comes in whiter raiment, and you say to the man in whiter raiment, come, we have this seat for you right down here. Right down here, we got a seat for you right down by Joe. But for you, you see that back corner over there? We got back over there, even back of David, back over there, we got a seat for you. Do we not realize that we live in a world where we invite people to the gospel? They may not be fairly well-to-do, middle-class people like me and you. And they may come with a lot of baggage, and they may come with a lot of scars, and they may come with messy lives. They may come shipwrecked. True story. I have an elder friend in another city, was calling me two weeks ago, was talking to me about this, really frustrated about something, and that had some visitors that come in that had moved from another state. These people were Christians. And the man came to church on Wednesday night in his shorts from work. And the response by some of the elders was, we got to talk to him. And this one said, no, let's give it time. Let's give it time. Well, in time, he went and bought some new clothes and was beginning to wear nicer clothes on Sunday morning like everybody else. In elders meeting, they said, we got to talk to him. He's coming in those shorts. We got to talk to him. And this one said, give it time. I promise you, I'll talk to him. Well, the next Wednesday night, he was out because of a healing from a surgery. And so two of the elders said, well, he's not here to talk to him. Let's talk to him. So they talked to him about his short wearing. And now they don't have to worry about him wearing shorts anymore. They solved the problem. Because now he's not coming. And the reason they know was because he had been contacted by the young preacher to find out, why aren't you coming? This is not indicative of a relationship with God. It's not indicative of spirituality. And if someone comes in just a little bit different than we do, I'll tell you what will happen if we say you're welcome. Is in time they will notice and they will learn and we can teach them. Or we can say you're not welcome because you're not dressed right. Folks, if we're going to talk to people in the world about the gospel, we're talking about people in the world whose lives are messy and who have to be given time for transformation to take place. Publius spent 3 days with Paul and said, you're welcome. Second, he spent 3 days with Paul. He spent 3 days with Paul. Time magazine every year does the famous top 10 famous people, top 10 significant things that happen in life, most influential people. If you were to make your Time magazine list of most influential people, who might they be? Who would be on that list of the most influential people? Well, I got to tell you, one of the people on my list is not a Christian. He's passed away. He was my high school vocational ag teacher. He's the guy that turned me on to VOAG and the Future Farmers of America that made me love it. And I still love it. And I love it now that my grandsons are involved in it. And his name was Bill Miller. I'd come to school one morning after misbehaving in a weekend, and he'd found out about it, and I went to the office to talk to him, and I thought we were going to have a good time, and he looked at me and said, Ricky, I just want to let you know I'm disappointed in you. Man, that meant a lot to me. He wasn't a Christian. Who's going to be on your top 10 list of people? Is there somebody in the world that has made a profound impact on your life that's helped shape you because they were kind and they were generous because they spent 3 days with you? We say, well, we expect that of our brethren, but are we going to be on anybody's top 10 list? Are we going to be on the infamous list? Here he just spent 3 days with him. And by the way, after spending 3 days, isn't it interesting the Holy Spirit, by Luke's pen, includes him in this text? And this is all we have of the man. That's all we have of the man. He is obscure. But this man opens his home courteously to Paul as he's traveling. And then they're in Malta 3 months, and tradition says that he obeyed the gospel, and tradition says that he helped start the church at Malta. If that tradition is right, do you not see the impact that here the presence of Paul had upon this man as this man generously invited him into his home and made a difference? And made a difference. Now, here's the bring it home sort of thing is this. Am I going to be the one, like him, out of kindness and generosity, that makes a difference? Because many times that's what people need. Not the sword, not the rebuke. They need the kindness and the generosity. And by the way, a fruit of the Spirit is, the lesson Jordan presented, kindness. And so if we're going to be like God and bear fruit of the Spirit, then that's going to have to be part of our spiritual makeup and our spiritual DNA. But here's a man of the world that shows us what it looks like. Right after World War II, there was a man by the name of Jan Belsrud, who was a part of the Norwegian Special Forces. And as the war was winding down, he and a group of men were going into Germany to knock out a German air control tower. The boat they were in, they were discovered. 8 of the men were killed. 3 of the men were taken captive and were executed. 11 men. He survived, and so other Norwegian Special Forces helped him survive and ushered him out of Sweden, but he spent 27 days in a snow-filled cave, freezing, had 9 toes amputated that he amputated himself to save his life, to keep from gangrene from setting in. When he died, he had inscribed on his tombstone, "Thanks to all who helped make me free in 1943. And he was called the 12th man. And there was a movie made about the 12th man. Thank you for all that helped me be free. We have the message. We have the God. And we can do what Publius did because we're not of the world. We're like the Father. Will it be that someone writes on their headstone, "Thank you. Thank you for making me free"? If we can help, why don't you come while we stand and while we sing?